In many retellings of rural life documentaries and mountain survival narratives, stories sometimes grow larger than the reality they come from. One such widely circulated account focuses on a workshop associated with a well-known wilderness figure, often portrayed as deeply private and committed to traditional living. Over time, simple descriptions of a rustic workspace can become exaggerated through repetition, editing, and audience imagination. What begins as a straightforward place for tools and craft work can gradually be reimagined as something mysterious or symbolic. In reality, such workshops in remote forested environments are usually practical spaces used for woodworking, repairs, storage, and experimentation with natural materials. However, when filmed for television or online media, the atmosphere, lighting, sound design, and narration can dramatically reshape how viewers interpret what they see. This story reflects how easily perception can shift when nature, isolation, and human curiosity intersect. Rather than focusing on sensational ideas, it is more useful to understand how narratives form around real people and real places, especially when those places are rarely seen by outsiders. The workshop in question becomes less about secrets and more about how storytelling evolves in modern media. Turtle Island and mountain life in remote mountainous regions like Turtle Island is often shaped by self-sufficiency, environmental awareness, and long-standing traditions of living close to the land. People who choose this lifestyle typically prioritize manual work, seasonal cycles, and practical skills over modern conveniences. Daily routines may involve maintaining structures, managing natural resources responsibly, and teaching survival skills to visitors or students. In such environments, isolation is not unusual, it is often intentional and part of the philosophy of simplicity and focus. However, isolation can also lead outsiders to project assumptions onto these spaces, imagining hidden meanings where there are only routines shaped by necessity. Mountain life is physically demanding and mentally grounding, leaving little room for unnecessary complexity. What may appear mysterious from a distance is often routine to those who live it. Understanding this context helps separate romanticized storytelling from lived experience. Rather than being places of secrecy, these homesteads and learning centers are typically focused on education, sustainability, and personal discipline, all grounded in practical engagement with the natural world. The workshop in the forest. A workshop situated deep within a forest is usually built for function rather than appearance. Constructed from locally sourced materials like wood and stone, such spaces are designed to blend into their surroundings while providing shelter for tools and work activities. In rural settings, these workshops serve as essential extensions of a homestead, used for repairing equipment, crafting furniture, or processing natural materials. Over time, the organic aging of wood, moss growth on roofs, and shifting forest cover can make these structures appear more mysterious to outside observers than they actually are. Lighting conditions under dense tree canopies often create dramatic visual effects, especially on camera, which can further enhance the perception of secrecy or isolation. In reality, these environments are shaped by practical needs and environmental adaptation rather than hidden purpose. The workshop becomes part of a larger ecosystem of human activity in the forest, where every structure serves a clear and functional role. What may seem unusual to visitors is often simply the result of living closely with nature over long periods of time. Curiosity of film crew. When documentary or reality television crews enter remote environments, their presence often introduces a new layer of interpretation to everyday life. Camera equipment, storytelling goals, and editing choices can unintentionally shift focus from routine activities to visually striking moments. A workshop that is normally quiet and functional may appear more dramatic when observed through lenses designed to capture engaging content. Crew members, unfamiliar with the rhythms of the environment, may also interpret normal behaviors as unusual simply because they lack context. This is a common phenomenon in observational filming, where the act of recording changes the perception of what is being recorded. The curiosity of the crew is natural. They are tasked with finding compelling narratives, but it can also lead to overemphasis on ambiguity. In many cases, what is portrayed as mysterious is simply unfamiliar. The presence of a film crew often becomes part of the story itself, influencing how events are framed and remembered. even when the underlying activities remain entirely ordinary and practical in nature. First approach to the cabin. Approaching a remote cabin or workshop through dense forest paths can feel immersive due to the sensory environment. The narrowing of trails, filtered sunlight, and quiet atmosphere create a strong sense of separation from urban life. For visitors unaccustomed to such settings, this transition can feel symbolic, even though it is purely geographical. Cabins in these regions are usually positioned for accessibility to natural resources like water, wood, and open land, rather than for concealment. The walk towards such structures often highlights the density of the surrounding ecosystem, where wildlife activity and plant growth dominate the landscape. From a narrative perspective, this approach is frequently used in documentaries to build anticipation, even when nothing unusual awaits at the destination. In reality, arriving at a workshop typically reveals a functional space shaped by years of practical use. Tools, storage areas, and work surfaces reflect ongoing daily labor, rather than hidden meaning. The contrast between expectation and reality often becomes a central theme in storytelling about remote living. Inside the workshop. First impressions. Stepping inside a rural workshop for the first time often reveals a space organized around utility. Workbenches, hand tools, raw materials, and partially completed projects are commonly arranged according to frequency of use rather than aesthetic design. Natural lighting and ventilation play important roles in such spaces, especially when electricity is limited or absent. The interior may appear weathered due to constant exposure to outdoor conditions, but this reflects long-term use rather than neglect. To outsiders, the lack of modern organization systems might seem unusual, yet everything typically has a practical purpose understood by the builder. The atmosphere is shaped by sound, texture, and smell, wood shavings, natural oils, and the presence of living materials being worked on. These sensory elements can create a strong impression, particularly for visitors expecting a more standardized workspace. However, beneath this surface impression lies a simple reality. A workshop is fundamentally a place of creation and maintenance, where tools and materials support ongoing practical work tied to survival and craftsmanship. Tools and handcrafted objects. In traditional workshops, tools are often handmade, repurposed, or carefully maintained over long periods. Unlike modern industrial settings, where equipment is standardized and replaced frequently, rural environments emphasize durability and repairability. Handcrafted objects found in such spaces usually reflect practical experimentation with available materials like wood, metal, and stone. Items that may appear unusual to outsiders are often adaptations designed to solve specific environmental challenges. For example, modified blades, reinforced handles, or custom-built mechanisms are common in survival-oriented craftsmanship. These tools are not symbolic or mysterious, they are functional responses to real-world needs. Over time, the accumulation of such objects can give a workshop a highly personalized character, reflecting the builder's experience and resourcefulness. To observers unfamiliar with this style of making, the diversity of tools may seem confusing, but within context, each item has a clear and logical purpose. This diversity is one of the defining features of self-reliant craftsmanship, where innovation arises directly from necessity rather than commercial design standards. Journals and personal notes. Many individuals who live and work closely with nature keep journals or notebooks documenting observations, ideas, and daily experiences. These records are often practical rather than mysterious, serving as tools for reflection, planning, or tracking environmental changes. Entries may include sketches of plants, weather patterns, tool designs, or notes on seasonal behavior of wildlife. In some cases, handwriting may vary depending on time, mood, or urgency, which can make older notes appear cryptic to outsiders. However, such variations are normal in long-term personal documentation. The purpose of these journals is typically to preserve knowledge gained through experience, especially in environments where formal instruction is limited. When viewed without context, these notes might seem unusual, but within the framework of independent learning and observation, they are simply part of a continuous process of understanding the natural world. They represent an ongoing dialogue between a person and their environment, rather than anything secretive or extraordinary. Natural materials and experiments workshops in forested environments often involve experimentation with natural materials such as wood, plant fibers, resins, and minerals. These experiments are usually practical, aimed at improving tools, building techniques, or understanding material properties. For example, testing how different woods respond to moisture or how natural adhesives perform under stress can be essential knowledge for sustainable construction. Containers and storage systems may hold samples collected over time, each labeled according to its origin or intended use. While such collections might appear unusual to unfamiliar observers, they are fundamentally part of material study and craftsmanship. The goal is not mystery but improvement of practical skills. In many traditional settings, knowledge is built through direct interaction with the environment rather than formal laboratory study. As a result, workshops become spaces of continuous learning, where observation and experimentation merge. This hands-on approach reflects a deep connection to nature and an emphasis on self-reliance rather than abstract theory. Audio recordings and nature sounds. Recording natural sounds is a practice used in environmental study, education, and artistic exploration. Forest environments produce a wide range of audio patterns, including wind movement, insect activity, bird calls, and shifting vegetation. When recorded, these sounds can reveal subtle changes in ecosystems that are not immediately noticeable in real time. Some individuals collect such recordings to study seasonal variation or to better understand ecological rhythms. However, audio captured in dense natural settings can sometimes be difficult to interpret due to overlapping frequencies and background noise. This can lead to imaginative interpretations by listeners unfamiliar with field recording techniques. In reality, these recordings are often scientific or observational in nature, intended to preserve environmental information rather than convey hidden messages. The complexity of natural soundscapes is what makes them fascinating, but it does not imply intentional communication beyond the biological interactions occurring within the ecosystem. Environmental, atmosphere in forest. Forested environments are dynamic systems where light, temperature, humidity, and sound constantly shift throughout the day. These changes can create strong sensory impressions, especially for individuals unaccustomed to extended time in nature. Early morning fog, dense canopy cover, and sudden weather changes can all influence how a place feels emotionally and physically. In such conditions, even familiar locations can seem different depending on time and season. This variability is a normal part of ecological systems and does not indicate anything unusual beyond natural processes. Wildlife movement, plant growth cycles, and atmospheric conditions all contribute to the overall experience of being in a forest. For those who live in these environments, such changes are expected and understood as part of daily life. For visitors, however, the same conditions may feel unfamiliar or intense, simply due to lack of long-term exposure. Understanding this difference helps ground perception in environmental reality, rather than interpretation shaped by imagination or storytelling. Emotional reactions of visitors. People entering remote natural environments for the first time often experience heightened awareness due to unfamiliar sensory input. Sounds seem louder, spaces feel larger, and visual details become more pronounced. This is a natural psychological response to new surroundings, where the brain processes increased environmental information. In group settings, these reactions can be amplified through shared attention and discussion. One person's observation can influence how others interpret the same experience. In documentary contexts, this effect is often intensified by filming equipment and narrative framing. However, these emotional responses are not indicators of hidden meaning. They are simply human reactions to unfamiliar environments. Over time, most visitors adjust to the setting and begin to perceive it more normally. The initial intensity fades as familiarity grows, revealing the underlying simplicity of daily life in such places. Emotional interpretation plays a large role in how stories are remembered, often shaping long-term perception more than the actual events themselves. The role of isolation and imagination. Isolation in natural environments can significantly influence human imagination. When external distractions are reduced, the mind often becomes more sensitive to internal thoughts and external stimuli. This can lead to increased reflection, creativity, and perception of detail. In storytelling, isolation is sometimes portrayed as mysterious, but in reality, it is often a condition that encourages focus and simplicity. Without constant technological input, individuals may become more aware of subtle environmental changes. However, this heightened awareness can sometimes be misinterpreted as something unusual. Imagination naturally fills gaps when information is incomplete, especially in unfamiliar settings. This is why remote locations are frequently associated with myth-like interpretations in media. In practice, isolation is a neutral condition. It can be beneficial for learning, reflection, and craftsmanship. The meaning assigned to it depends largely on perspective rather than objective reality. Misinterpretations and rumors. When stories about remote places circulate without full context, they often evolve into exaggerated or distorted versions of reality. Misinterpretations can arise from incomplete observations, selective editing, or imaginative retelling. Over time, these versions may become more widely known than the original events. Rumors tend to grow when they involve unfamiliar environments or private individuals, as gaps in information are often filled with speculation. In documentary settings, this effect can be amplified by audience expectations for drama or mystery. However, most real-world situations in rural or wilderness environments are far more straightforward than they appear in retellings. Misunderstandings often stem from the difference between lived experience and narrated experience. Recognizing this gap is important when evaluating any story that claims unusual or extraordinary circumstances in otherwise practical settings. Documentation of wilderness knowledge. Wilderness living often involves systematic documentation of knowledge gained through experience. This may include tracking animal behavior, plant cycles, weather patterns, and tool performance. Such records are valuable for long-term sustainability and teaching others who wish to learn similar skills. Documentation can take many forms, including written notes, sketches, diagrams, and physical samples. In environments where formal infrastructure is limited, personal archives become essential sources of information. These materials are typically organized in ways that make sense to the individual who created them, rather than following standardized systems. While this can appear unconventional to outsiders, it is highly functional within its own context. The purpose is preservation and transmission of knowledge, ensuring that practical understanding is not lost over time. Far from being mysterious, these records represent structured engagement with the natural world. Scientific curiosity versus myth. There is often a distinction between scientific curiosity and myth-making when interpreting unfamiliar environments. Scientific curiosity involves observation, testing, and evidence-based understanding, while myth-making arises when gaps in knowledge are filled with narrative interpretation. In remote natural settings, both tendencies can appear depending on perspective. Observations of unusual tools, sounds, or behaviors may be scientifically explainable, but still feel mysterious to those without background knowledge. This difference highlights the importance of context in interpretation. Rather than assuming hidden meanings, it is more accurate to consider practical explanations grounded in environmental science, craftsmanship, and human behavior. Myths often emerge because they provide emotionally satisfying explanations for complex or unclear experiences. However, they do not always reflect reality. Understanding this distinction helps maintain clarity when evaluating stories about wilderness life. Changing weather and forest behavior. Forests are highly responsive to weather conditions, which can change rapidly and influence both appearance and sound. Shifts in temperature and humidity affect how plants move, how animals behave, and how light travels through the canopy. These changes can create striking visual effects, especially during storms or seasonal transitions. For individuals spending extended time outdoors, such variations become familiar patterns rather than unexpected events. However, for occasional visitors, these same changes may seem dramatic or unusual. Wildlife behavior also adapts to environmental conditions, with animals moving differently depending on food availability, weather pressure, and seasonal cycles. None of these changes require extraordinary explanation. They are part of natural ecological systems. Understanding these patterns helps demystify experiences that might otherwise be misinterpreted as unusual. Ethical questions of filming, private life. Filming individuals who live in remote or private settings raises important ethical considerations. Consent, context, and representation all play key roles in ensuring that footage accurately reflects reality. When editing emphasizes dramatic elements, it can unintentionally distort how a person or place is perceived by audiences. This can lead to misunderstandings or exaggerated interpretations. Respecting privacy means recognizing that not all aspects of a person's life are intended for public viewing. Even in documentary contexts, boundaries are essential for maintaining trust and accuracy. Ethical storytelling requires balancing audience interest with fairness to the subject. Without this balance, narratives can shift away from truth and toward entertainment-driven distortion. Responsible media production acknowledges these limitations and strives to present context alongside imagery. Reflection on human perception. Human perception is shaped by environment, expectation, and emotional state. When people encounter unfamiliar settings, their minds naturally attempt to interpret what they see using available reference points. This process can lead to misunderstanding when context is limited. Sensory input alone does not guarantee accurate interpretation. It must be supported by knowledge and experience. In storytelling, perception often becomes more influential than factual detail, shaping how events are remembered and retold. This is particularly true in visually rich environments like forests, where lighting and sound can vary dramatically. Recognizing the role of perception helps separate observation from interpretation, allowing for a more grounded understanding of complex narratives. It also highlights the importance of context when evaluating unusual or unfamiliar experiences. Understanding the Forest Workshop stories about remote workshops in forests often grow in complexity when they are retold through media or online narration. A simple workspace built for tools and craftsmanship can gradually be turned into something mysterious when viewed without context. In reality, such workshops are usually practical places where woodwork, repairs, and daily maintenance take place. They reflect a lifestyle focused on self-reliance and close connection with nature. The atmosphere may seem unusual to outsiders, but it is shaped more by environment and isolation than anything extraordinary or hidden. Life in remote mountain areas. Living in remote mountain regions involves a strong focus on simplicity and practical survival skills. People in such areas often rely on natural resources, seasonal cycles, and hands-on learning rather than modern infrastructure. Workshops, cabins, and outdoor spaces serve essential roles in daily life, supporting activities like building, repairing, and teaching. To visitors unfamiliar with this lifestyle, the lack of modern tools or structured organization can feel unusual. However, for residents, these conditions are normal and efficient ways of living in harmony with the environment. How media changes perception. When film crews or media teams document isolated environments, their storytelling choices can influence how viewers interpret reality. Lighting, camera angles, and dramatic narration can make ordinary spaces appear more intense or symbolic than they truly are. A quiet workshop or forest path may be presented as mysterious simply because it looks visually striking on camera. This does not necessarily reflect the actual purpose of the place. Instead, it shows how storytelling techniques can shape emotional responses and sometimes blur the line between fact and interpretation. Workshops as functional spaces. A forest workshop is typically designed for practical work rather than aesthetics. It may contain tools, raw materials, storage areas, and unfinished projects used for everyday tasks. Over time, natural aging of materials like wood and stone gives the space a weathered appearance. To someone familiar with such environments, everything inside usually has a clear purpose. However, visitors may misinterpret the layout or contents as unusual simply because they are unfamiliar with the tools and methods used in self-sufficient living. Human curiosity and misinterpretation. Human curiosity plays a major role in how unfamiliar environments are understood. When people encounter settings they do not recognize, they often try to assign meaning based on imagination or limited information. This can lead to misunderstandings, especially in isolated natural locations. Small details may be exaggerated into larger ideas when retold. In reality, most observations in such environments have simple explanations grounded in practical use, environmental conditions, or personal habit rather than anything unusual or symbolic. Nature, sound, and atmosphere. Forests are dynamic environments where sound, light, and weather constantly change. Wind through trees, shifting temperatures, and wildlife activity can create strong sensory impressions. For someone unaccustomed to these conditions, the experience may feel heightened or even overwhelming. However, these changes are normal parts of ecological systems. What may seem unusual is often just natural variation in a living environment. Over time, regular exposure helps people understand these patterns as ordinary and predictable rather than mysterious. Conclusion and open interpretation. Ultimately, stories about remote workshops, wilderness living, and isolated craftsmanship often reveal more about human imagination than about hidden realities. While such environments can appear mysterious when viewed from a distance or through edited media, they are typically grounded in practical routines, environmental interaction, and long-term skill development. The contrast between perception and reality is what gives these stories their lasting appeal. Rather than focusing on sensational interpretations, it is more meaningful to appreciate the craftsmanship, discipline, and connection to nature that define such lifestyles. Open interpretation allows space for curiosity while still respecting reality. In the end, what seems unusual is often simply unfamiliar, and understanding grows when context replaces assumption.